us, just to make sense of all the recent policy developments in India. And as part of this learning process, we unpack, as Donald Rumsford would call it, known unknowns and unknown unknowns with the help of public intellectuals and policy practitioners. For today's conversation, especially in light of conversations around Q1 GDP growth numbers coming yesterday, we couldn't have asked for a better person to make sense of our economy and how do we realize the goals of our economy. So I welcome our Chief Economic Advisor, Dr. K. Subramanian, to today's IA Talks. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Subramanian, for making time to engage with young public policy enthusiasts on this call. So this session is being streamed on Facebook Live as well. So before I open up and request Dr. Subramanian to give his opening note, I'd like to briefly introduce him for the purpose of our audience. As most of you know, he's an expert in economic policy, banking, and corporate governance. PhD from Chicago Booth, IIT and IIM alumnus, and a professor of finance at Indian School of Business. He has an academic pedigree in all the well-known institutions. He led the 2019 economic survey that actually laid out the strategic blueprint for India to become a $5 trillion economy. And the slew of reforms that were implemented in the recent COVID stimulus package by the government of India draws on a lot of key economic reforms advocated by him in the last two economic surveys. Thank you again for joining us, Dr. Subramanian. No better person to make sense of what's happening around us. So yeah, you've spoken extensively about what's happening in the last two quarters in terms of degrowth because of the pandemic and a possible recovery path. So I request you to help us make sense of the economy's current health and what do you see as the path to recovery in the coming quarters and the medium term.
So very good afternoon to everyone, and thanks for inviting me to share my thoughts. Firstly, what I have to remark is that this particular print that has been recorded for the April to June quarter is primarily due to an exogenous shock that is being faced globally, the COVID-19 pandemic. I will give you one statistic which I think illustrates the magnitude of the shock that all of us are living through. If you look at the fraction of countries where the GDP per capita is going to shrink, that fraction will be the highest in 2020 since 1870. In other words, in the last 150 years, there hasn't been an event that is going to shrink GDP per capita as much as as this. So that tells you the extraordinary event, the extraordinary exogenous shock that we are facing. The pandemic required a lockdown. April to June quarter, there was a global lockdown, with India having among the most intensive lockdowns, which itself was required given our population, given our population density, and the need to to preserve lives, which all of us will agree is faced with a pandemic that has to be a non-negotiable objective. So the restrictions that were put because of the lockdown, severe restrictions on economic activity, have therefore had an impact on the output that has resulted. Just to give you one comparison, let's take the United Kingdom, and I'm choosing United Kingdom because the size of the UK economy is almost identical to that of the Indian economy in terms of if you take the dollar value of the GDP, it is almost identical. During this quarter, April to June quarter, India had a far more intensive lockdown than the UK economy. The UK economy shrunk by about 22%, and that is despite the 15% package of GDP package that they had given. India had come up with a 10% of GDP. They had come up with 15%. Of that 15%, their fiscal component was about 3.4, 3.5%. India's fiscal component was about 1.5% of the 10%. But overall, when you look at in terms of GDP, the impact on GDP is the overall package that matters. So their package was almost 1.5 times that of ours, and yet their economy, shrunk by 22%, despite a lockdown that was less, far less intensive than India. So that explains why, the Indian economy has had this print. This is not certainly reflective of any of the fundamentals. It is an exogenous shock. That said, if you look at the, some of the important indicators to speak in terms of what can we look forward to, I would focus on some indicators because these are usually leading indicators for economic activity. If you take a look at e-way bills, you look at steel and power, steel and cement, consumption. Those are typically important. Power consumption, railway freight. So when you look at these four set of indicators, e-way bills in the month of August, we have data for the first 26 days of August, are almost the same level as August of 2019. In fact, it's 99.8%. The railway freight was at 95% level in July compared to July 2019, and for the days for which we have data in August, it is 6% higher, than it was in August of 2019. Power consumption is about 1.9% less, so 98.1% of last year's, and steel and cement consumption are also similarly about 90 odd percent. So now this is after a sharp decline in the month of April. They have recovered to come to these levels. When you look at the aggregate of all this, you look at what is called the core sector, performance. The core sector had shrunk by 38%, so a sharp decline, 38% in the month of April. Since then, it recorded, so it was down, 22%. This is year on year, 22% in the month of May, 13% in the month of June, and 9.6% in the month of July. So from 38, 22, 13, 9.6, which is basically indicative of of the recovery. So when you put all these indicators together, what it basically suggests is there is a V-shaped recovery that is that is going on. Recovery is happening, and so the worst is behind us. Going forward, there will be things will certainly be better. That said, though, I must say that there is still residual uncertainty because the pandemic has not been brought in control. And this is one key aspect that we have to understand, compared to if you take previous crises, that were caused by economic factors, be it the global financial crisis or the Asian financial crisis. Those crises were caused by economic factors. And so governments could basically identify those economic factors and fix those. As a result, the uncertainty that is created can be fixed as well. The reason I say this is that uncertainty affects consumption, and especially discretionary consumption, because all of us indulge in the precautionary motive to save. This is economic jargon for basically saving for a rainy day, that all of us indulge in. For instance, many of you, normal times would have gone for a movie, might have gone for a vacation, or gone to restaurants actually to eat, which none of us are doing right now. So normal activity is impacted, and these are primarily discretionary spending, and which none of us is indulging in. That is why, in aggregate, discretionary spending is down. So this uncertainty, which is causing discretionary spending to go down, is primarily due to the pandemic. It's a health factor. So unlike previous crises where the uncertainty was caused by economic factors, In this case, the uncertainty is being caused by a health factor. So, there is little that economics can do in that. It is basically, a COVID vaccine coming in, which can help. The, palliatives can be definitely used, and the government has been providing to try and reduce the impact as much as possible. But the original, cause is basically the pandemic, which is what is affecting consumption. Final point actually I want to mention is, and this is this, arithmetic of India's GDP that all of us should keep in mind, which is if you take GDP is comprised of consumption, it's comprised of investment, it's comprised of government spending and net exports. Net exports is a small component because it's exports minus imports, so let's ignore that. Consumption accounts for almost 60% of India's GDP. In contrast, government spending accounts for about 12% of GDP. In other words, government spending is 1/5 of consumption, 1/5 of consumption. So if there is a 1% decline in consumption, in order to offset that, government spending will have to increase by 5%, because that's the, it's 5 times less. And because of the constraints on resources, etc., when you have a 27% decline in consumption, to offset that, there has to be actually then a 135% increase in government spending to entirely offset this. Here I've not talked about investment. Investment, accounts for about 25% of GDP in the Indian context. So 60 plus 25, these two together account for 85%. So, this is in the private sector. This is really important to keep in mind as well when you think about what is the extent to which government can offset declines in, these two items, which is consumption and investment. That said, as I've said, already, government has basically tried its very best to minimize the damage. The Atmanirbhar Bharat package, which I had referred to earlier, was 10% of GDP. Which the central bank and the government combined to try and reduce this impact. So just to summarize, I think what one has to recognize that this is an exogenous shock, which has basically what has brought the GDP down in this quarter. But things are clearly recovering, and so going forward, subsequent quarters would be better. But there is still uncertainty, which is caused by the pandemic, not an economic factor. And so, resolving that will basically, it's a vaccine. In between, government policy, of course, will continue to offer palliatives. But the original problem is the uncertainty, which we have to recognize.
Thank you, Dr. Subramanian, for actually laying out the framework very clearly and actually, illustrating, what are the variables at play and, what are the key factors. So I had a couple of questions which came through kind of social media as well, especially related to the stimulus package. So the first one you mentioned as well, which is kind of the need to focus on consumption. And the question is that 10% of the stimulus that was provided through the Atmanirbhar package focused a lot on monetary policy and supply side stimulus. Is there something more that could be done from both kind of the government side and the private sector side to actually stimulate kind of the demand side? Is there a stimulus possible on the demand side to activate consumption? Is there an opportunity to kind of unlock possibly value that is not being tapped into right now, controlling for the rate at which we solve the public health crisis? Yeah.
This is again, Tarun. I have already talked about this. It's a subtle point, but which all of us have to understand. I was talking about the impact on discretionary spending. When you talk about demand, it is basically demand for consumption, and we can break that up into demand for essential, goods, and demand for discretionary goods and services. Now, it's the demand for discretionary goods and services that is affected by uncertainty, which in turn is because of a health factor, not economic factor. So this logical sequence is something that all of us have to keep in mind. That if, for instance, the demand decline was because of economic factors, yes, fixing those economic factors would bring down the uncertainty and thereby perk up discretionary consumption. But this is, just throwing cash in the hands of people is not going to solve the uncertainty, because it is coming from a pandemic. So even if, let's say, I were to offer you all of you, let's say 5,000 rupees and say, go and watch a movie, you'll say, Dr. Subramanian, keep your 5,000 with you. I don't want to risk my life. I basically go and for your 5,000 rupees to go and, watch a movie. And that's so if I give you that 5,000, you'll go and put it in the bank and say, maybe, if I might need it for tomorrow, if I actually have to buy some medicines or whatever. And that's going to not perk up consumption of discretionary items. That's the first point that we have to keep in mind. That said, there is clearly, the government has, as I said, announced this package, the 10% package. I already said that, if you take the GDP as comprised of consumption, investment, government spending, and leave the net exports part out, when you take the credit and the liquidity that has been provided both by the government and the central bank, what does it do? When you have credit, that credit basically goes and reduces the impact, the decrease in consumption, primarily in times like this. It either affects consumption or it affects investment. In times like these, it's not going to affect investment that much, because typically private sector and corporations are risk averse. They don't want to invest as much. So the credit and liquidity that is offered then goes and affects primarily consumption. So it's not quite correct to just focus on the government part, because GDP is comprised of both of consumption, investment, and government. And those parts of the package, even above and beyond the government spending, which is credit and liquidity, also affect through consumption and investment, but primarily consumption. So that's that's an important point to keep in mind. In some sense, it's basically, one can summarize this by using a saying that Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese premier, used to say, I don't care about the color of the cat as long as it catches mice. So that 10%, it's as long as it actually goes and contributes through credit and liquidity to consumption, it is still something that is actually helping the economy. I think that is an important point to remember. That said, there can be some short-term, measures that can possibly be thought of, which will not fully offset the effect of the uncertainty, but can basically be at the margin, have an impact on some of these, and something that we are thinking about.
Right. Thank you for that. And like you rightly said, the uncertainties around the expectation around when kind of the public health crisis would possibly get resolved, and what's kind of your optimistic sense of when would we most likely be able to flatten the curve, and is there any economic intervention that could be done to kind of influence the expectations, because sentiments also drive some of the consumption patterns. So is there anything that could be done to one is direct investments in public health, but is there anything economically that could be done to influence the expectations, the sentiments around economic activity?
So first thing, Tarun, that we have to recognize is that the government has indeed responded by creating infrastructure, and that's something that the lockdown provided. It provided that window to be able to to sort of create the infrastructure quickly to respond. For instance, I mean, this is one aspect of policy making that we all have to contend with, which is that there is you don't get to see the what if scenario, which is what if there was no lockdown, let's say, right? But in order to measure the impact of any policy, you have to ask that counterfactual question, which is to measure the impact of the lockdown, you have to say, what if the lockdown had not been implemented? What would have been the situation? There are several academic studies, including those by IITs and ISI, etc., which have actually looked at that and said that we may have had far more cases, number one, and the cases would have actually come very early without the health infrastructure having actually, shaped up to take care of some of the, the cases. And if, for instance, the cases, let's take the same number of cases, but saying, let's say these number of cases had all manifested in, let's say, the month of April, then the health infrastructure wouldn't have been able to take that much. And therefore, the effect on mortality would have been far higher because of lack of adequate care. So, in some sense, by basically pushing it, the lockdown at the very least, of course, it has also had the impact of making us all aware of this pandemic, in a country where typically we have a chalta hai kind of attitude, absent the lockdown, some of us may not have, really appreciated how important it is to actually, to really be careful here. So, despite that, if you just take as it is the numbers, but say just take, allocate it in time differently, then the mortality would have been far higher. So I think that this is something that we have to keep in mind. In policy making, one has to often, allow for the possibility that hindsight is 2020, but decisions have to be taken with foresight, which is, but that's par for the course. So the health infrastructure, I think the health spending has indeed, has happened at the state level and the center. I think Delhi is a good case in point where when the cases were going up, center and state came together, basically increased testing, created the infrastructure, and thankfully, therefore, it has actually been brought under control. So it's important to, in this context, I must, mention, see, we are a country of almost 1.4 billion people, 135 crore people. So just the state of Gujarat, for instance, has about the same number of people as Germany, right? Just one state has as many people as a country. You take the numbers basically on a, and with, pandemics like the COVID, which basically spread through the network, higher population can mean, higher chances of getting infected, especially because, in our country, the population density is also very high, and that too at the bottom of the pyramid. So social distancing, etc., is much harder. So these are some very important realities that we have to keep in mind, and to ensure that we are making an apples to apples comparison, and thereby infer, what is the policy that has been, implemented, and what has been the impact of that policy. It's oftentimes, if you basically look at these in a lay manner, you'll just look at the number and say, oh, this is how it is. But without taking into account the various determinants of the, of this, I think one can possibly sort of misinterpret, the efficacy of the policy.
Thank you for that. That makes sense. I think, it's always, difficult to figure out what the counterfactual is in kind of ex ante. It's only ex post, like you kind of see all the area of options and, tend to come to a conclusion about the impact of a particular policy.
Even ex post, you don't get the counterfactual.
Yeah.
So ex ante, the decision has to be taken.
Right.
Among many paths that can result, many policy choices, one of those manifests.
Right.
If there was a different policy choice that was taken, one of the other, counterfactuals, any one of the other counterfactuals would have manifested. But even ex post, you don't know what would have been the counterfactual. So, that's something that has to be constructed, by taking different policy options. That is something which is very important to keep in mind.
Makes total sense. Yeah, there are a lot of questions coming in on the chat, Dr. Subramanian, and on social media as well. So what I'll do is we can start kind of taking questions now.
Yeah, just that, some people may not understand ex ante, ex post. It's actually a Latin word and typically used technically. So let me just clarify for the interest of everybody. Ex ante is before the event and ex post is after the event. So, let's say, just to give a very simple example, it's rainy season. So, let's say I want to make, when I'm leaving home in the morning, I have to make a decision whether I should be taking an umbrella or not. That's the decision I have to make before the event. And at the end of the day, then I get to see it rained or it did not rain. So my taking the umbrella or not taking the umbrella, I may have gotten wet or I may not have gotten wet, if depending on which of the two options. So you basically get to, if I took the umbrella, I would, and it rained, it actually, then the umbrella is very useful. But if I did not take the umbrella, different policy of different outcomes come about. So that's the before the event, after the event. So ex ante is, in the morning when I'm leaving before the event. Ex post is in the evening after having observed what has happened through the day. In this simple example, that's all. So in the context of the pandemic and the lockdown, ex ante is basically around mid-March or so, when the decision had to be made. Ex post is now having seen basically that we did the lockdown, but there could have been a different ex post outcome, different path, saying if the lockdown had not been implemented, what would have been the path of actual number of cases, the mortality, the time dimension, how it would have come in time. All that actually is also, so in order to measure the impact of the policy, you have to take that particular ex post path that would have resulted if the lockdown had not been implemented. And that is why it's a counterfactual to measure the impact of the policy.
Right, right. So it's actually a very good segue into one of the questions, Dr. Subramanian. And I think, this kind of pandemic has, and like you said, has been an exogenous shock and really shown kind of the effect public health crises can have on our economy. The good part is the expenditure on social services, especially education, health, by central states as a proportion of GDP has increased by 1.5 percentage points in the last 6 years, from 6.2 to 7.7%. So the question is, how much do you think the government should be idly spending on public goods like health and education? And I guess one allied question which came through is, given that a lot of these services within health and education are fragmented, is there a pathway to convergence, like the pathway taken in other middle-income countries to consolidate the delivery of public goods by the government?
So that's a good question. Of course, ideally public goods, because they have what we economists call externalities and positive externalities. Investment in public goods is always actually is good, but that would be a statement that one would make in an unconstrained world. But in a constrained world, there are different trade-offs that are at play. So I think the pandemic has clearly illustrated that it's not necessarily the quality of health infrastructure that is the only determinant. Countries like Italy, UK, Spain, the United States, all of these have actually faced substantial mortality. And given the scale of the pandemic, even in these advanced economies, the health infrastructure, which is far more advanced, has not been able to respond. During the lockdown, for instance, we all would have seen images of people in Italy, basically beds outside, just outside the hospital. So it's just the scale of the pandemic which has has basically not enabled them to be able to provide the necessary infrastructure. I think in that sense, given our health infrastructure, I think we've been able to do a very good job of not having mortality go so much. That said, I think across the world, everywhere, the pandemic illustrates that there is basically a need for greater investments in healthcare. I like your the second sub point in your question, which is of bringing together different sources of spending. I think that is indeed a low hanging fruit. Because if you think about, just apply basic economics, if you are a big buyer, you are basically, you have monopoly power. And by bringing together, different arms of the government, could be, for instance, just take, if one collects, let's say, CGHS, railways, defense, all of them together, then, you have a large buyer, rather than fragmenting, demand, and thereby thereby not generating indeed, enough bang for the buck. Pulling them together can indeed, increase the buying power, and therefore, even within, the existing spending, the bang for the buck can be maximized.
Makes sense. Makes sense. So I'll ask questions related to consumption that have come through on the chat. So one is from Lakshit, where he's asking that
we're not repeating the same thing.
Yeah,
I've explained the stuff on consumption, very carefully. So, if it is about the subtleties of what I've talked about,
yes,
people could basically go back and look at the video again. I don't want to be repeating myself.
I'll make sure that that's the case. Yeah. So this seemed like a nuance that we could speak about. So one is kind of where the consumption is focused, like given that it's focused in metros in tier 1 cities, which also happen to be the epicenter of virus. So is there a possibility to activate rural consumption, and what more can be done by the local governments in activating this rural consumption?
So see, I think if you look at the sectoral composition of the of the GDP print that came yesterday, despite the severe lockdown, agriculture sector grew by 3.4%. Every other sector basically had a negative print, while the only sector that had a positive print was agriculture at 3.4%. And I think that is indeed manifesting the question that has been asked. The reform measures that were announced as part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat package, especially the APMC reforms and the Essential Commodities Act, both of which were big hindrances in unleashing the power of agriculture. Till these reforms were basically were announced, the Indian farmer had not gotten the freedom, despite 74 years of independence, had not gotten the freedom to go and sell his or her produce where he or she wanted. He or she had to just was forced to go and sell in the local mandi. Similarly, the farmer did not have the freedom to choose when to sell, his or her produce, because storage was equated to hoarding through the Essential Commodities Act. And, and that affected storage infrastructure, that affected warehouse infrastructure, none of which came up. Food processing industries, for instance, which actually are a big opportunity, those did not grow as much because of the absence of storage and warehousing infrastructure. Now, through these reforms, the potential in the agriculture sector has been unleashed, and that is what is sort of indicative if you look at the agriculture sector growing at 3.4%. Also, one more point, if you look at the contrast between rural inflation and urban inflation, for the last 2.5 years, rural inflation was lagging behind urban inflation, but has increased, compared to urban inflation. So it's basically a flip, and that flip is reflective of rural demand picking up, significantly more, which should happen even more, going forward. So I think, some of this potential in the agriculture sector and the steps that have been taken for the small and medium enterprises, MSMEs, the 3 lakh crore, emergency credit that was part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat package was, directed at the MSMEs. So these two together will actually help substantially the rural economy and those pockets that are not as affected by the pandemic as some of the urban and tier 1 cities.
Got it. Got it. So I think like your comment on MSMEs kind of link me to the next question, which is kind of the correlation between the stock market performance and the economy. So in spite of actually the economic growth rates having a negative trend, the stock markets have gone up in the last 3-4 months. And so the question is, what is your sense of why is there a negative correlation, and does it kind of indicate the advantage maybe corporations have over MSMEs in absorbing such exogenous shocks? Is there any structural advantage that they seem to have in being more resilient, and which is reflected in the stock markets and their performance indices?
There are a couple of points here. One, if you look at stock markets, not only in India, globally, the liquidity conditions, which is basically saying how much money is out there, has become quite benign. In fact, has been very supportive, because the central banks all over the world have basically put in more money into the economy. When the real sector activity is not picking up as much, what happens then is that money ends up going into the financial sector. And conceptually, financial sector values in the financial sector are just reflections of its of what is in the real sector. Because if you take a stock price is basically the present value of all future cash flows of a firm discounted at a particular cost of capital. So that is, the price is basically reflective of in the real sector. So when you have more money chasing the same assets, that does basically push up asset prices. So that's one key part that you have to remember. Now, so when you interpret the real economy versus the stock market, keep this in mind. As to your second point about resilience, all over the world, it's seen that size provides resilience. For that larger firms are able to withstand shocks much better. That is true everywhere. And so it is in fact in the interest of MSMEs, therefore, to grow. When MSMEs grow, the biggest benefit that comes is basically to themselves. For instance, rather than so let's say there is a to take an example, suppose there is a government policy which says that you will get this particular benefit if you have less than 100 employees. What promoters may think is basically, oh, let me stop at 95 or 98 employees, and because then I will stop getting the benefits, so let me start another firm, maybe in my wife's name or uncle's name or whatever. But what what has to be recognized there is that actually affects productivity, and therefore profits for the promoter and the entrepreneur. Because scale does provide important productivity gains, because economies of scale is one key determinant of productivity. So rather than thinking in this way of basically, let me not grow the firm because I will lose this particular benefit that the government is providing, it's better to grow the firm because suppose when a firm is, let's say, having a turnover of, let's say, 500 crores, and the promoter has, let's say, a 50% stake in it, he makes 250 crores. At, let's say, when the firm is producing 5,000 crores, with the same, he would have 2,500 crores. And this is true also for the way in which promoters should be thinking about taxes as well. Rather than focusing so much energy on saying, okay, let me reduce my tax bill, if they spend their energy on growing the firm, that they basically can grow from 500 crores to 5,000 crores. Even if you give, let's say, 33%, versus, let's say, you're giving 10% now as taxes. You give as 10% as taxes, you're basically keeping, let's say, the remaining 90%. That's 450 crores, of a 500 crore turnover. But even if you're giving 1/3 of 5,000 crores, you're still left with 3,300 crores. And 3,300 crores is any day better than 450 crores. That's the way the thinking should be about expanding the pie. Thereby, the promoter basically does better for himself and at the same time contributes to the economy as well. Because, at the level of the economy, taxes are but, something that is changing from the left hand to the right hand. The left hand is basically corporations or individuals giving to the right hand, which is government, and that doesn't, change the size of the pie. So, the larger point here is that our MSMEs should be focused on, on growing their firms, because that provides them resilience, number one, and at the same time, increases the profit base for the promoter as well. So, dur ki socho, badi socho.
Great points. So actually on that note, there are a couple of questions on growing the pie, especially in manufacturing sector and within MSMEs. So one question is, sir, on how can we revive?
Maybe last couple of questions.
Yeah. So one is like, what could we do to kind of grow the size of the pie with respect to MSMEs and especially within the manufacturing sector? So how can we break them free into kind of becoming big firms? And linked to that is, which are the prospective sectors to drive kind of India's economic growth in the medium and kind of the long-term future? What do you see as the most prospective sectors?
So for your first question, I would refer all of you to read the, the July 2019 economic survey. There was a chapter which was, titled enabling MSMEs to become giants, and where all this was covered in great detail. There are also videos, short videos about, I think 2.5-3 minutes long, on the chapter, which you can watch as well and read the chapter, because it's been covered extensively, labor reforms, some of the size-based incentives, all those actually have been covered in great detail. So that's what I would refer you all to. In terms of sectors, I think, what the COVID pandemic has clearly illustrated is basically, our firms need to be thinking about becoming ready for the fourth industrial revolution that is happening. And this industrial revolution is based on data, is based on, on basically enabling being part of the formal economy. Because when you're part of the formal economy, again, you actually have ways to sort of dampen shocks. Because think about it, a company that, let's say, has a lender to go to, can borrow in times like these, versus if you have to only rely on friends and family, then, the ability to withstand shocks is not as high. And if you just take, over the last 20-year period, there have been many shocks, and then, all companies need to think about actually that shocks will be there in the globalized world. And so building that resilience is something that is important, which the companies need to be thinking about. So overall, the small firms and firms that are particularly those that youngsters are creating, I would say, you should first focus on, don't be myopic. Think about creating a larger pie, which is, this seems like a cliche, but it is a cliche because it is so important. Think about win-win, something where you create greater profits for yourself, but at the same time also contribute to the country's economy. And that happens by growing the size of the pie, not just focusing on basically, kaise main apna tax kam karu, for instance, just to give one example. Focus on becoming part of the formal sector, being part of the GST network, because if you're part of the GST network, the data there is can be used. You can use that to actually get loans. If you, for instance, file taxes, the tax return becomes actually a proof for you to go and get a loan. That brings you into the formal economy. So, think about technology primarily. I will give you, a personal anecdote. When I was doing my BTech thesis 25 years back at IIT Kanpur, at that time itself, I had worked on the application of neural networks in electrical engineering. These were, part of basically what was being worked on academic research at that time. But, a lot of that started coming into the corporate world about 10, 12 years back. many of the, the forward-looking firms implemented, some of this, artificial intelligence. Neural networks is basically was a precursor to artificial intelligence. So, when this stuff was there 25 years back, so what I would urge is for entrepreneurs to go and spend time, visit the IIScs of the world, the IITs of the world, look at what are the technologies that are there. It's technological upgradation and being at the cutting edge of technological frontier is what will actually keep you ahead. Because, whether you, like it or not, technology is what is going to be part of data, technology, analytics, AI. These are what are going to be part of the fourth industrial revolution. So either, the choice you have is the following. You keep thinking in old ways, remain resistant to change, and thereby risk becoming a dinosaur, or go and embrace technology, be flexible to change, and thereby reap the rewards from it.
On that futuristic and optimistic note, we'll end with one question and maybe final notes from you, Dr. Subramanian. One is what are some of the economies like you benchmark and keep track of in terms of their economic policies, and are there particular countries that you really track that I know, like any truism about India, the opposite also holds true, but do you particularly kind of track any countries? And connected to that, a personal question, like what really worries you and keeps you up at night in terms of kind of the state of our economy or the future of our economy? Yeah.
So on your first question, I actually, so I follow some of the large economies very closely, but I try to read a lot of research because, and this is important because at the macroeconomic level, there are so many interlinkages, and that, in some sense, there is, if you as a policymaker, let me put it this way, as a policymaker, what one has to pay attention to is causality, not correlation. I'll give you a story. This comes in many of our folk tales, which the story goes as follows, that a crow came and sat on the branch of a tree. Right at that time, the fruit fell. The crow thinks that it made the fruit fall. So that's the crow is attributing causality to it when it may be just two correlated events. It's possible that that particular fruit on that branch of the tree was ripe, and so it fell. Any other, if the crow had gone and sat on a different branch of tree, different fruit, it wouldn't have fallen. Or maybe a gush of wind flew at that time and that's why the fruit fell. I'm giving you this story to distinguish between correlation and causality. Policymakers have to actually have to understand this difference and this nuance between correlation and causality. And that is why I pay a lot of attention to academic research, careful research, not just academic research. There's some even policy and industry research that does careful work which distinguishes correlation and causality. So I read that across both India and the rest of the world, and that's where I actually get my continue getting my insights. So overall, I follow the advanced economies and the BRICS economies as well. But apart from following broad economic indicators, to gain my insights, I actually read a lot of research. In fact, my mornings are often spent reading research. Your second question, what is it that worries me? See, of course, we are basically living through a once in a century kind of crisis. So there is no denying that that these are difficult times, and from the strata of society that I come from, I've come from very humble background, and so I always am able to relate to how a crisis like this would affect someone like me, when he was young, for families like that. That said, what is also important to keep in mind is that, we will get through this phase. When we are going through extraordinary times like this, there is a tendency to believe that it will be like this only. This is what behavioral economists call saliency bias. If those of you who are interested should read this very nice book by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, where he talks about this, which is, simply said, when we are in normal times, we keep thinking that only normal times will perpetuate. And when we are in extraordinary times, we then keep thinking that the same extraordinary times will perpetuate. That's the saliency bias, just paying attention to recent data. So I tried to be, sort of aware of that bias and saying that even this will, we will, go through this. And it certainly helps that I am an incorrigible optimist. And, I refuse to be affected by the cynicism. Criticism and ground realities are something that I of course take into account, but cynicism is something that I refuse to get affected by, and that really helps.
Thank you for being open and sharing that. So any final comments on what a lot of people on the call are young public policy enthusiasts and involved in different public policy roles. So any kind of advice to young people on this call? I missed some questions. If people did have questions on, what is kind of the pathway out of poverty for millions of Indians in India. So maybe if you could touch upon, what's your advice for young people? What role can civil society play in this path to recovery and maybe, poverty alleviation as well?
So I think one key guidance that I would give youngsters, and this is something that I used to tell my students as well. If your only ambition in life is to be rich, it shows an extreme poverty of ambition. I hope you all get the play of words, the rich and the poverty. So if your only objective in life is to be rich, it shows an extreme poverty of ambition. I think if there is a mission that you want to have in life, I would say this particular sort of statement captures the mission that I would advocate for youngsters. Second piece of advice that I would give you is I think this has been said enough number of times by many great people, but it's still there's no harm reiterating it, which is genius is 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration. So don't forget that 99% perspiration. And finally, especially in times when we are going through a health pandemic like this, make sure all of you pay attention to your health, not just now, but through your life. So the parallel that I draw is all of us in life, we juggle many different balls. We're juggling at the same time many different balls. It could be your career, it could be your personal life, it could be friends, it could be your health. So what I want to say is that career and others are mostly those are rubber balls that even if you take your eye off those, they may bounce to the ground, they may fall on the ground and bounce back. But your health is something that is actually, it's a glass ball. You cannot take your eye off that particular ball, because if it falls to the ground, it will break into pieces and you will be left picking those pieces subsequently. So that's my advice, to remember that all the other balls are rubber balls. The only ones, I think, your health and I would possibly add your family as well. Those are glass balls that you make sure you don't take your eye off them. So in pursuit of the rubber balls, don't lose sight of the glass balls. That's sort of the broad three messages that I would give youngsters. And I think in terms of your second part of the question on poverty, I think the Indian economy after liberalization has clearly shown that it is basically growth that is, what creates, that basically lifts a lot of people. I think in thinking about, if you basically, I'll use this parallel, think about a pizza and then the slices of the pizza. Let's say all of us were to have a pizza party now, we would have break it maybe into some 20, 30 or, slices. With a small pizza, we all of us will have to actually, fight over, how much for me, how much for you. Grow the pizza, there is more for everybody. Yes, it's possible that Tarun may possibly take a bigger slice than me, but in a bigger pizza, there is actually bigger, slices for everybody. And that is what, that's one message that we cannot, it cannot ignore. We have to actually keep that really in mind. Growth is what is, paramount for a country like India.
Thank you, Dr. Subramanian, for being very patient and generous with your responses, and actually taking the time today with all of us to explain in great detail with a lot of thought and care. So we'll take your words to heart and keep track of our rubber balls and glass balls. So thanks a lot for that piece of wisdom, and we'll kind of focus on what we could do in our individual roles to really grow the pie, and with that kind of lift all the boats, like you say. Thanks a lot once again for being generous with your time and sharing your thoughts. And yeah, we're hoping that we are on path of a V-shaped recovery, and we do reach kind of that goal of $5 trillion economy, much before our target date. Thanks a lot for leading us with your annual economic surveys, and hope you continue to build that institution to the next level. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I know we missed a few questions, so we will kind of pick them up offline and